Well, good evening, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope blog and podcast, and I'm excited because Elizabeth Camden, when I was a teenager, and I know I'm not super far removed from that, but when I was a teenager, I loved her romance novels, and I would always be just waiting for the next one to come out and go to my local library and get it. And I'd finish it in a couple days, and then I would call my best friend, and we would talk about it for hours. Um, but one of my favorite books she wrote actually was Against the Tide. I loved that. And it's still something I own, and I just encourage you, even as a young adult, it's a really cool historical fiction novel, and that's kind of what Elizabeth Camden writes on is historical fiction and their romance novels as well. But there's always drama and romance and intrigue and a whole bunch of different stuff. Um, but so anyway, I've been really great that Elizabeth and I could finally connect. I know it's been a busy year for her, and it's just really neat to have this moment with her. Um, Elizabeth, before we start, I do want to kind of just give you a little plug because I know you just released a book that came out a
Mhm.
couple months ago. Can you talk about that a little bit for the audience?
Sure, sure. The book is called While the City Sleeps, and it is set in 1913, New York City. A lot of my novels, they're set mostly in Gilded Age America, which is sort of 1880 up to World War One. And I always like that because as a historical era, women are entering the professions. They're not stuck on the farm.
Yeah.
I'm not a farm woman, so I wouldn't know how to write that. I've always worked. I've always had a job, and I got married very late in life, and so um, I was a single woman who worked, and that is what appealed to me as heroines for my novel. So in this book, the heroine is a dentist, and women really were into dentistry. It was easier for women to go into dentistry than some of the other medical fields, and
Huh.
so that's the plot. And she gets into some trouble, and World War One is on the horizon, and so there's lots of tension. And she falls in love with a mysterious guy, and fun and games erupt. And that's really it's a fun book. It's an inspiring book. It's got lots of insight into New York City in the years leading up to World War One. So that's While the City Sleeps, and it's out now, available everywhere.
Did you do you have a favorite book you've written so far that turned out exactly the way you wanted it to? Because I would
Um,
imagine with publishing deadlines and stuff, I mean, you have to get things done at a certain time. So
right.
while each one may be good, there may be ones where you're like, that ended or was written the way I really wanted it to be.
Okay. Well, did you notice I struggled talking about While the City Sleeps? I have to say, I have written 19 novels. It is perhaps not my favorite novel. Nobody starts a novel and says, uh, wow, I just want to write a book that's good but not great. But
I'm
sometimes that
sure.
happens because you're under contract, you know? Now, I do think that this is a good book. It is a really good book, but I know the sequel to it is great. It's a home run, whereas this one was a good solid base hit. But you asked about, do I have a favorite novel of all the ones I've written? I do. I do. Every novel I write, I try to include three things. Um, a very cool facet of history that people don't know about. So I've written about the perfume industry, I've written about the food industry, I've written about the passage of some major laws in American history. So I
Mhm.
try to do a plot centered mystery. And then I try to do a romance, always do a romance. And then I do a very light faith theme where people have to struggle with a moral issue. Um, it could be an outright faith issue, like believing in God. It could be, can I shake the problems I had? I've had characters have to overcome drug addiction or other alcohol addiction. Um, so I try to do those three things and weave them in. And if I can get all three aspects of a novel to sing, then I know I've done it well. And I would have to
Mm.
say that I think I did that. The very best novel I've ever written is one called With Every Breath, which
Hmm.
is set. with a very heroic doctor trying to cure tuberculosis in the 1890s. Now, tuberculosis, that was almost always fatal. And there was no cure. Tuberculosis was not cured until the 1940s and 50s, was when they finally started coming up with the antibiotics that could cure it. Um, so I think if the reader understands about the history of TB, they know he is not going to cure TB by the end of the novel. And he risks his life every single day because when he treats the TB patients, he is exposing himself. It's a communicable disease.
Hmm.
Um, and so the faith theme and the moral theme is very strong. And the woman who falls in love with him, she's a widow and she fears death above all things. And so he is a very inconvenient person for her to fall in love with. And I think that that was the book that I had all three features really sing. That was my favorite book, and that was called With Every Breath. Now, you mentioned that your favorite book of mine is one called Against the Tide. And although it's not a perfect book, but I will say that that novel saved my career because it's very hard to get a publisher. It's very hard to make it in this business.
Hmm.
And I tried to get published for about 6 years. And I wrote five manuscripts and I sent them off each time with great
Wow.
hope that somebody was going to sign this book. And it never happened. And year
Hmm.
after year after year went by. And I was just getting every book. I thought, this is it. This is the book that's going to get me published. Um, well, eventually it happened. I had about 150 rejections before I got
Oh my
the
gosh.
call. I still remember that day. Um, I was signed to a two-book contract, and I was just over the moon. And then my first book came out. It had one of the most beautiful covers ever. I was so grateful to get a beautiful cover. And my publisher put a lot of money behind it. They took out advertising. They paid for it to be prominently displayed in bookstores. When you walk in, it was there on the front table. Well, it didn't sell. It didn't sell at all. And then my second book, I think it was even a better book, but that book didn't sell. And I was really looking at not getting my contract renewed, but I
Hmm.
had already written Against the Tide. I had already written that manuscript. And my publisher was sort of on the shelf. Well, have you got anything? Let's see what you've got. And I sent them Against the Tide. And they said, oh, yeah, we'll sign this. This is good. And so they gave, again, I got a great cover. They didn't put any advertising behind it. So it didn't make a lot of waves when it came out. But at the end of the year, I entered it in all the contests, all the writerly contests that you're supposed to do. And for the first time, it got nominated across the board. And then it won almost every award in the book, in the business. It won the two very
Wow.
highest awards for any romance novel. It's like the equivalent of the Academy Award. It was called the Rita Award. And then I also got the Christie Award for it. Well, when you get those two awards on the same book, that gets you put on the map. And so all of a sudden, that book that had been out there for more than a year, actually almost 2 years by the time the award season hit, it just turned everything around for me. And so I am incredibly
Wow.
grateful to that book. And so,
I see. I feel so validated. I'm like, wow, yeah. It's an
yeah, I mean,
amazing book. I couldn't put it down when I was reading it, especially, I think, too, being a young teen at the time, like Alexander Bainbridge was just like, you know, the mysterious, handsome man. I still remember like my image that I'd have in my mind of
yeah,
him.
yeah.
Anyway,
Well, thank you for remembering him. To this day, I probably get more letters about that book than any other. And I do have people who send me pictures of how they imagine what Bane looks like, because he's not the classic hands. I mean, he's very good looking, but he's one of the few times I've ever done kind of a slightly built character. He's not tall. In fact, he over
yeah.
and over I say throughout the book, he and Lydia are the exact same height. They're eye to eye. Um, And so he's not a physically strong character, but he scares the heck out of everybody he comes into because he's just got this tightly coiled sense of danger, and wit, and he's very smart, and he projects that, and I think that that's what appeals to people. um, I'm very grateful that that book came into my life. And, sometimes people say, well, where do you get your ideas? And heck, I have no idea where that book came from. I'm just glad that he visited me in my daydreams one day.
Well, I wanted to ask because you've written, as you said, 19 romance novels, and it's like, but you didn't get married until your mid 30s.
Yep.
So, was it not painful to write so many romance novels and not feel
Um, I didn't start writing aggressively until after I got married, but I've always loved
okay?
reading romance novels. I mean, that's what I cut my teeth on when I was a kid. Well, first off, I started reading, I was very much into Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Watership Down and sort of fantasy. And then by the time I got to high school, I found a couple of romance novels, and it was like, wow, I've always loved romance novels, but I never thought to write one. I became a librarian, and I worked for 25 years as a librarian. Now, I worked on the college level. And so when you work on the university level as a librarian, you're classified as a college professor. So I had to publish. I was a business librarian. So
Hmm.
I published all sorts of stuff about how to do business research. Well, that was where I devoted my career. And I was very good at it. I was very successful. I got to work at Ohio State University, is where I did a lot of my work. Um, and it was great. And then I got tenure. And I continued to publish nonfiction um, articles about the nature of research and businesses and how to dig up statistics and write a marketing plan and all the stuff you do when you're a business librarian. And I just got tired of it. And one day I thought, what if I wrote a novel? And I toyed with the idea, and I wrote my first draft of a novel. I was already married by the time I wrote my first manuscript.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, this is the best thing. This is just great. I am going to send it to the best agents, and I'll just pick whoever I like the best. Well, I didn't realize that that's not how it works. And so I was kind of stunned when I got a resounding silence when I set out my manuscripts. And then I got real serious because I enjoyed writing and I really loved it. And I was very proud of that manuscript. So I bought a lot of books on how to write a novel, and it helped. And then I suddenly realized, oh boy, I made every mistake in the book with that first manuscript, and it's not even worth dusting. And so I wrote a second manuscript and then a third, and we've already discussed my long career of failure writing novels. My sixth manuscript was the one that hit, and my husband throughout all of that. He was just he really encouraged me because I think he knew that I enjoyed it. And we were both very busy with our lives at that point. He worked longer hours than I did. And so I had time to work on them.
Hmm.
And, uh, but no, a lot of people who read romance novels, it's not a consolation prize for people. A lot of people think that sometimes. Oh, poor lonely old maid alone, eating her bonbons and reading her romance novels. No, those novels are not consolation prizes. I think what attracts women to romance novels is seeing a strong character and being able to walk in her shoes for a little while. She's usually very clever. She usually has a lot of challenges thrown her way, and she has to figure out how to shoulder them and
Yeah.
triumph. And along the way, I know there are a zillion different types of romance novels. There's erotica that it's not much more than sex scenes. And then there's ones that don't have a whole lot that are very wholesome and safe that you might see on a Hallmark movie channel. Those are not my novels. My novels, I tend to throw lunges at my heroines, and they don't know how they're going to come through, but they always do. And they always get a guy, a really attractive, appealing man, to fall in love with them by the end. And that's another form of oh, triumph isn't the right word. It's another form of accomplishment. I personally, I was single until I was 35, and I always wanted to be married. But I didn't meet the right guy. And I was always, am to this day, a massive introvert. And I could be happy on my own for the rest of my life. I don't need a person, a man, a husband. I got too late to have kids. So I don't have children of my own. Um, but I have a husband who I adore. And I'm glad I waited. Um, and so romance novels, they're fun. And as I said, I think one of the reasons that makes them so attractive to women, and it's one of the most best-selling forms of literature out there. Every now and then, mystery will overtake romance, but for the most part, romance is a steady seller. And I think women just want to walk in the footsteps of a strong and attractive woman. Even now, when I say attractive, I don't necessarily mean a bombshell Marilyn Monroe. Attractive, I mean someone who can hold her own, someone who's smart,
Mm.
someone who has something to offer the world.
I
So
would
that's,
think that people would like romance because of the love aspect, because I feel like so many people crave love from anybody, really, just to be loved and to be understood. And romance novels do kind of offer that scenario.
yes, I think a good romance novel does. I don't want to say that they're instruction manuals,
Oh,
because a
yeah.
lot of times you see characters doing really stupid things, or an author who falls back. I call it shorthand when, oh, the two characters look at each other and they fall in love and they just know. They don't even have to speak. They meet eyes across the room and they're in love. Well, that's nonsense. I could never get away with that in my genre. Um, and so I have characters, they tend to be a little older than a lot of romance novels. So my characters are usually in their late 20s or early 30s.
Yeah.
And they have to have difficult conversations. They have to learn to respect each other. I can't stand romance novels where the two characters just say, "Oh, I hate you. I hate you. Oh, you're my enemy. Let's hop into bed." That's nonsense. It's not believable. So I
Yeah.
have them, there's got to be a realistic reason why the two characters can't get together. I told you that I think the book that I'm proudest of, With Every Breath, the two characters love each other. They respect each other. But she works for him. She's his assistant in the TB ward, but she begs him to quit working with tuberculosis patients because he could die. And she
Yeah.
had her brothers die from an infection when she was young that damaged her. She was married, and her husband died in a construction accident that damaged her again. And she is not going to walk down that path again. And so to have a husband who is putting his job before her by working with patients who he could very well kill him if he gets too close to them, he contracts their disease, she feels like, "You're putting your job before me." And he said, "It's my calling. I am on this earth to cure tuberculosis. And you can join me on that journey, or we wish each other well." So there's a real challenge. There's a real stumbling block between them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I always, in every single book I write, I try to have a real stumbling block, not just a silly misunderstanding that can be solved with a good conversation. And I think it's important to have to almost to model those in my novels. It's like, this is how people do it. If you're going to have a good relationship that where respect is flowing both ways,
Yeah.
this is how you do it.
I agree. You know, for you personally, what do you think has been the biggest challenge? Because, you're talking about a lot of your characters are facing their fears, right? Or they
Mm-hmm.
are um, coming across a weakness in their character that they're having to overcome or to work through or to question. For you personally, what do you think has been your biggest life stumbling block that's something that you work
Oh,
on and hope to grow in more?
okay. Well, I think we discussed already that I'm a pretty massive introvert. And I would have to say that when I was growing up, it was actually a problem. Um, I really didn't want to leave the house. I had to go to school. I had a family, I'm from a huge family, 7 kids, and our grandmother lived with us. So there were 10 people in my household, and most of them are very outgoing, fun people. And I just would prefer to stay home and read a book or look at the fish tank. I had a fish tank, and I could just stare at that fish tank and be mesmerized by looking at these fish. Um, but that's a lonely life. And going to college was hard for me because it took me out of my comfort zone. Making friends is a challenge. My husband is an extrovert. And so in a way, we're a very good match. But getting out and making friends can be difficult to this day. And I know that he'd like me to be more outgoing. And so that's a challenge. We just moved. Our we just moved. I am in a new house. I have not even finished unpacking. For those of you who can see me on TV or on YouTube, I've got unpacked books around me. Um, and I am going to have to start that thing of making friends in middle age. Somehow
Yeah.
it's easier in college when you're joining groups and you're in the college play or you're in the band or you have a dorm and there's all these, 50 women on your floor who are all your same age going to the same classes. But when you want to move into a new neighborhood in your 50s, and all of a sudden it's like, how do you make friends? And so every week, every week I've told myself I'm going to do one new thing a week. I'm going to go to a new church, or I am going to go to a book signing somewhere, or I am going to go to a park. I'm going to do one thing that gets me out of the house every week. And sometimes my husband and I, we have very different interests. He goes out and plays golf and poker, and he does all kinds of group things. And I'd kind of like to go look at the manatees in the springs nearby, or go
Oh,
bird
wow.
watching. But sometimes we'll go together. Sometimes I can get him to go with me. Um, but yeah, that is my biggest challenge to this day is getting out and getting out of my comfort zone. And so, yeah, there's the answer to the long-winded answer to your question.
No, no, not at all. I was gonna say, how do you make friends? Like for you, does it warm your heart or help you to become friends with someone if they initiate or if they remember something you've said? Like what's kind of the little gem in a conversation or an
Boy,
interaction where you're like,
if,
"Ooh, I'd like to be this person's friend."
if I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't have this problem. Um, I I think one of the best things I did when I was in Orlando is my husband had a dinner group with his golf buddies, and their wives would come along, and so I joined this very large dinner group, and that was great. I mean, I that was really great. I was sorry to leave that group when we moved. I think that friendships just take time, and it does get harder, I think, as you get older because people have kids, they've got families, especially when you move into a new community. I'm in a very small town. And so in a way that makes it easier because people notice you at the store. It's like, we haven't seen you before. But friendships are yeah, I am lucky in that I do have a big family. My brothers and sisters, even though we live all over the country, I do have a great family. I was great. I was very blessed to be born into a good, strong family.
How did you meet your husband if you were really
My husband,
introverted? Yeah.
well, I am a librarian, and he came to the library for help with business research. I was the business librarian, and this was in Dayton, Ohio, and he was still working. He was in the Air Force, and he was doing a project for gosh, it was CAD, computer assisted drawing, and he needed some statistics. And he came into the local library. I was working at Wright State University at that time, and I helped him in the library. And he asked me out. I said yes.
He asked you out the same day?
No, no, it was not the same day. But I learned later that we lived in the same apartment complex. He was only in town for a few weeks. And in my apartment complex, which was right next to the university, they had, what do you call those? Corporate apartments that are, they're fully furnished, dishes, dishwasher, everything. And so he was staying in one of those corporate apartments while he was working there's the Wright Pat Air Force Base is there. And we met, and at the end of his assignment there, he went back to Utah, which is where he was living. And we had an email correspondence. And this was before cell phones. This was in the 90s. And so we wrote email every day. This was back when phone calls were still really expensive, long distance phone calls. And so we had a long distance relationship, and he got to come out to Ohio quite a bit on business. So that's where we would see each other. And then for my research, I got tenure, and I was able to get a month of leave to go work on research. I went out to Utah for a month, and then we got engaged. We got engaged and got married while we were still living in different states. And
Oh, wow.
right, and it was like, well, what do we do? Because I'm at a really great point in my career. I had moved to Ohio State by then. I didn't want to move again. I mean, getting tenure is really hard, and getting an academic librarian position is hard. I mean, that's kind of, at least from my point of view, that's the cream of the crop for librarianship, is to work in a college library. So I didn't want to move, and we ended up moving together to Florida because his company wanted to transfer him to Orlando. And I thought, well, I'll go to Orlando. And I was able to get a job at Rollins College. And we were there for 22 years. And we just retired out to rural Florida. We are in the middle of nowhere. There's like horse pastures in one direction, orange grows in the other. And then if you go towards the coast, there's all these natural springs that have manatees in them, and they're beautiful. So we're out in the countryside now, and it's great.
So you ended
But
up in the end choosing to leave, even though you really wanted to
we left
stay.
Orlando. Yeah, we did not. We were ready to go.
No, I
We
meant
had
before that, when you were married, just married, you did decide to leave, even though you really,
Yes,
that
yes.
must have been hard.
It was hard. There was a book at the time, and I think it's still out there. It was called Who Moved My Cheese? I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It
No.
was a famous health self-help book in the 90s, and I mean, it was a massive bestseller for years, called Who Moved My Cheese? You can read this book in 20 minutes. And it's a little parable. It's almost written for like a child's book. It's about two mice who all their life, on page one, the two mice, they go and they get a piece of cheese every day because someone puts a piece of cheese out for them. And then one day there's no cheese, and the two mice are baffled. And day after day, they're getting weaker and more confused because the cheese is not showing up. So the one mouse says, I'm going to go look for cheese somewhere else. And the other mouse says, don't go. You're going to risk it. You're risking everything. You're leaving your home. You're leaving what you know. And the other guy says, the other mouse says, I've got to leave. I don't see cheese coming. I don't think it's going to change.
Hmm.
And so he leaves. And the whole book, like I said, you can read it in 20 minutes. And I just really did a terrible job summarizing it. But it's about making hard choices, getting out of your comfort zone in order to find something better. And I had heard about this book for years. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I am about to quit a job that I love, that I've gotten tenure at.
Hmm.
I'm moving across the country. And this is new, I'm getting stepchildren because my husband had two daughters. And
Oh,
I have
wow.
no children. I have no experience with children. The girls at the time were like 11 and 13, I think, when we got married. And I thought, this is just too much. This is too much change all at once, all in the space of a week. I was going to get married. So I had to sell my house. It was my first house, and I loved that house. Move across the country and inherit stepchildren. And at the time, we only had them like every other weekend, but that changed within a year, and we were custodial. That was a lot of change. And I remember, I think, just reading that book, Who Moved My Cheese? And it's like, you just got to change. You just got to, this guy's worth it. I'm going to do it. And I got real lucky. I mean, the girls grew up very well. They're now on their own now. They're in their 30s and are very happy and happily married and have good jobs, both of them. And I feel
Well,
like I did a good job. In a way, I had children and that I inherited children. Um, and I inherited good children. Sometimes you hear nightmare stories about step parents and stepchildren. It wasn't always easy, but I'm glad it happened.
well, a lot of your heroines in your book are kind of similar to you then, because they do make decisions like that
Yeah.
similarly. That's really
Well,
interesting.
I think in any good romance novel, actually any good novel, period, um, you've got to have something bad or somebody's life is going to change. You cannot have the kiss of death is happy people living in happy land.
Yeah.
You can't have, you know, and sometimes I'll be writing a book and it's like, oh my gosh, they're getting too happy. They're living in happy land. We got to throw a bomb into this. You have to have people who want something. There's got to be a huge aching, howling void in their life. And whether it's a lack of a career, whether their family situation isn't good, whether there's no jobs in their town, I mean, something's got to be bad. And they have
Yeah.
to, they're at the end of their rope and they've got to change it. And they're dynamic people. They're not just going to sit there. They're not going to be the mouse that sits alone in the room waiting for somebody to bring them a piece of cheese. So yes, I think that that's a good mark of a good novel. You should always have the characters tackle problems they don't know if they can solve. Um,
It's interesting because at the same time, we want resolve. We want those things to be fixed. I think in real life, we desire that obviously, right? If someone's in pain or if we're in a chaotic situation or a painful situation of some kind, we want it to resolve. And it's interesting because a lot of literature now, I would say, based on limited, I'm not going to say every book is like this, but your books do end well usually or
mhm.
resolve in a good way. Kind of like
Yeah,
with that keyboard, it's like you hit that nice note. But a lot of novels now, I feel like, don't get those deep answers settled. And so they
mm,
end and the reader's like angsty. It's kind of
yeah,
like, and I've always wondered, if that's a culture thing, if that's because now in our culture, a lot of us live very angsty lives
yeah,
because like the happy ending, even for books, for movies, it's not really a thing anymore.
yeah. I think people sometimes look down their nose at romance novels because it always has a happy ending. Well, that's true, usually. Sometimes you can have a little bittersweet ending. They don't get the happy ending the way they wanted it. They have to suffer on their way before they earn a happy ending.
Right.
But most genre fiction does. You don't read no Agatha Christie novel ever ends without the murder being solved. Adventure novels end with them finding the hidden treasure. Murder novels end with it being solved, mystery novels. So, yes, I like to have a good, satisfying ending. But people who write literature, the really highfalutin, highbrow literature, they like to have a sad ending. They like it to be up in the air or vague. And it's just a style. And it's not a style that I personally care for. It's been around a long time, highbrow literature. It's not, I am unashamed that I write genre romance novels. They're a little heftier the than the typical romance novel. But I love romance novels. I love knowing that the heroines are going to triumph in the end. And so, yeah, that's I. We all have enough for me enough stress in my life that I don't really like to worry that I don't like to read down. I'll just put it that way. I
Well, I
like to
know
watch people succeed.
you did
Yeah.
mention in your I know on your website that you love Hitchcock. Some Hitchcock
Yes.
films do not end well.
Sometimes they don't. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
Oh yeah. I would say North by Northwest or
Really? Everyone says that. I love
yeah.
Charade. That's my favorite.
Okay. Okay. Um, I think actually Notorious with
Hmm.
Ingrid Bergman and if you read Against the Tide, there's a little hint of Notorious, and I mean I was a little inspired by Notorious and Against the Tide.
Hmm.
Um, you'll see some markers, some Hitchcockian themes in there. So yeah, Notorious I think is probably my favorite, but for most enjoyable, I just love North by Northwest. It's an adventure, and I like that adventure. But um, there is, I don't know if you are familiar with Kenneth Branagh movies. He's an
Oh
actor
yeah.
and director. He did a movie, oh, it's probably 20 years ago now, and it's called Dead Again. And if I had to say what my favorite movie is, it's Dead Again. And he
Hey, I've
wrote
never
that
watched
as,
that.
oh, you've never seen it? If
No.
you like Hitchcock, he wrote it, he flat out said, this is my homage to Hitchcock. He used a lot of the themes, a lot of the camera angles, a lot of the
Hmm.
beats that Hitchcock did, a lot of the twists and turns and pacing. If you read reviews of the movie, it'll say, oh, this is like if Hitchcock were alive today, this is the movie he would do. So I just love that movie. Uh, it's
It's
called
called
Dead Again, Dead
Dead
Again,
Again. Hmm.
and it's a it's deeply romantic, but it's a twisty murder mystery, and it's got two stories, one in the 40s and one in contemporary times. And it's how these two twisty murder stories intertwine with the love story, of course. And I highly recommend Dead Again.
Wow. Okay. I've never heard of them. I have to look that
I
up.
think it's on Amazon Prime. But
Okay.
anyone who loves Hitchcock will enjoy Dead Again.
Well, Elizabeth, I do want to be, respectful of your time. I want to ask you one more question, one last question. Um, you know, you mentioned earlier you were talking about um manatees, which
Hmm.
I have never seen one in real life. I want to. I actually have a manatee webkin. I don't know if you remember the
Oh,
webkins, but I still have the toys, like the manatee
uh-huh.
toys when I was a kid. But if you had to kind of um, compare your personality to an animal and you became an
Oh,
animal, what would you pick?
oh, probably a cat. I don't even like house cats, but they're always watching. They're always back there. They're happy to just sort of sit on their own and look out the window and watch. That'd be me.
But you don't like cats?
I don't. I don't because
Wow.
they. We were not raised. We did not have pets in my household, and this is a little tip to people if you have children. Um, my mother disliked animals intensely, and so if we would go out, we'd pet a dog, like a neighborhood dog, and my mother would say when we'd come in, "Oh, go wash your hands. That's dirty." I used to love collecting bird feathers in the backyard, and I'd bring them in, and she would find them in my room, and she'd get so mad. She'd make us scrub the table and, oh, wash my hands and throw out the bird feathers. And so I think it seeped into me that don't pet that animal. You have to go wash your hands. So I've never had pets. I like
Oh
to look at
man.
pets, but I'm not a pet person.
You know,
You are.
Elizabeth,
I can see the look on your face that you love pets. You have
well,
pets?
no, I know what's hilarious is I had the exact same experience as you. My
Yeah.
parents were very much like dirty, dirty, dirty.
Uh-huh.
And I did not like animals because I would always have to wash my hands and I was a germ freak. And I was like, no. And then in my college years, I went through a really hard breakup. And I remember I was with a friend, and my friend was dog watching my professor's dog. And I wanted to spend time with her. So I went with her. And I was sad. I mean, I was sad every day, just this
Yeah,
despondent. I'm pretty sure, it was probably some depression kicking in there.
yeah.
And I sat down at the kitchen table and I was just kind of just sitting there, morosely. And this dog came up to me and put his paw on my knee and just looked at me as if he
Ah,
understood. And
yeah.
I was so taken aback. Like, I was like, this must be God, like, just giving me a little hug right now. And since that exact moment, I loved animals. It didn't matter if the animal was a dog, a cat, it didn't matter what it was. Like, I just wanted to hold it, all because of that one dog. And the funny thing is that dog's name was Tequila, which is such a funny name.
Yeah.
But that moment changed, and suddenly now I love animals. But I was just like you. I didn't like animals at all until it kind of intersected my life, and it felt like it
Yeah.
understood what I was going through.
I wish I had that. I really do. I, I really admire people who have dogs and who have that connection with them. I just don't know if I could do it.
You know
But
what?
I think
Just
it's great.
start slow. Like, start putting them in your
Well,
books, and
I've
then
been, there's a book I read and it's on my Kindle, so I can't grab it. But on Twitter, I follow a guy. He runs a dog rescue in Thailand, and his name is Neil. And every day I check in on his dogs, and I love the way he cares for those dogs. And I really do admire that. And so, yes, maybe one day.
well, Elizabeth, this has been so fun, and I've loved getting to know you, and I'm a fan of your books, and I mean, I'm just so grateful. Thanks for doing this, especially after you've moved and all this chaos that
Oh,
you made the time.
well, thank you for asking me onto your podcast. This was really nice. And it was nice meeting you too.
All right, well, have a good day.
All right. Thank you, Dan.
Bye.
Bye bye.